Well, thank you, Greg, for the introduction. Greg. Can you hear me okay? Right, so Bruce and I are very excited to be here tonight to tell you about this. And the first thing we want to do is break the rules. How many of you are excited to hear about Mars? Yeah, all right. Excellent. So, Bruce has, over 40 years of experience working with NASA and growing food in space. And I have about 30 years of experience thinking about nitrogen and how we get nitrogen into being able to use it in plants. And it was about 2.5 years ago that he and I were approached by a bunch of scientists at Stanford and Berkeley, and we got involved in this project trying to figure out Mars and how do you support life on Mars. And so we wanted to start by asking you all, what do you think are the biggest challenges to putting humans on Mars? Yeah, go ahead.
The distance to travel to Mars.
The distance, that's great.
No air.
Excellent.
No
air.
air. Yeah.
Right. No water.
No water.
That's right. How about way in the back?
Even getting there.
Getting there, exactly.
Yep.
Temperature.
What'd you say?
Temperature.
Temperature.
Cold temperature.
It's cold. Go ahead.
What energy source?
Yeah, that's a good one. We're going to talk about that.
We're going to talk about that.
Right. Back here.
Food.
Food. That's a good one because we're going to talk about that one. So that's great. How about here?
The magnetic field.
Ooh, that's an interesting one.
And all the cosmic radiation.
Cosmic rays. Exactly. What else?
Another emerging scientist right in the front.
Yeah,
here.
go ahead.
If there is, when you're trying to get to the spot that you want, there could be craters on the way, and a bunch of others.
Exactly. How about
Not
here?
easy to get there.
Exactly.
There's weird crap.
There's weird. Yes, exactly. Go ahead.
The cost of transporting water.
Ooh, yeah, cost of transporting everything. We're going to talk about
Everything.
that. Go ahead.
The spacecraft's ability to navigate and contain enough food.
How long do you think it takes for a spacecraft to get to Mars? Anybody have a guess? Go ahead.
2 years.
Wow, he's been reading. About 2 years.
This turns out to be a really good question. How long does it take to get to Mars? So Lance and I sat down and sharpened the pencil, and we did some calculations. And the way we teach this stuff is by analogies to stuff you can understand. I can tell you it's 140 million miles to Mars, but that, is that far? Who knows? Here's an analogy. You know that we go back and forth to the space station all the time. If we did an analogy to the Earth, going to the space station would be like going back and forth to downtown Logan from campus. Now how far do you think it is to go to the moon? Just the moon. If it's like to go into downtown Logan to go to the space station.
Salt Lake City?
Excellent. It's the same distance as going to the Salt Lake Airport to go to the moon. You nailed that. Man, that was excellent. Now, here is the really big question. How far is it, by analogy, to go to Mars? If the airport is the moon, it's farther, right? Maybe Los Angeles. Somebody give me you haven't, right there. Canada. Even farther. Canada's pretty far away. To go to Mars is the equivalent of going to Antarctica. So that tells you how much harder it is to go to Mars than it is just to go to the moon. Way harder. And that's what we're going to talk about, is how we're going to do that. Think of the size of the rocket. You said, how long does it take to get there? If we had nuclear fuel, nuclear fusion, we could have a rocket where you accelerate at 1 g, 1 gravity, and you would never have weightlessness. You're accelerating all the time. Now, halfway there, you got to stop and put on the brakes. And so you turn around, and you have to decelerate for the second half of the way there. If you could do that with nuclear fuel, you can get to Mars in 2 days. Amazing. But most scenarios with regular rockets, it's more like a year or more to get to Mars. And then you stay for a while, you wait till the planets are lined up again, and then you come back home, another year home. It's a long, long trip. So we want to make pretty sure we got it right before we go.
Yeah, I forgot that wrench. Oh boy, it'll take 2 years to get it there, right? So what we're going to talk about specifically, as you might imagine, there's a lot of things that NASA cares about, and there's whole divisions of NASA that we know some of the people in those divisions that are trying to figure out life support and various other support on Mars, and how does that kind of mission happen. We're specifically involved in the life support system, specifically in food. How do we get the food that you need? Now, one option would be that you could take the food with you, but as you heard from a lot of people here, this is going to be expensive. It takes 2 years to get there. So what we're trying to figure out is how would we actually produce the food that you would need to support, let's say, 10 astronauts on Mars for 170 days or something like that.
That's a lot of bagged lunches if you can't grow your own food.
And if you're just eating granola bars and dried food, you probably get tired of that after about a couple days, right? So you can imagine ramen. Well, that's a bad example because pretty men in the room can probably eat a lot of ramen if you're a graduate student or a student. So maybe we should just go to the
Let's
slides.
throw 'em some slides.
Yeah.
Now, this is our intro from this book, The Martian. If you haven't seen it, this is the trailer for The Martian.
Obviously, I have no way to contact NASA or my crewmates. Even if I could, it would take 4 years for another manned mission to reach me. And I'm in a app designed to last 31 days.
So, in the face of overwhelming odds, I'm left with only one option.
I'm gonna have to science the shit out of this. Okay, let's do the math. I gotta figure out how to grow 4 years worth of food here on a planet where nothing grows.
I imagine quite a few of you have seen that movie. Some of you might have read the book. Of course, when the people in my department read the book, I'm gratified to see so many colleagues here. We found all the math errors that he had in here. He didn't have the right amount of water, and yeah, hey, it's science fiction, right? So, but we used to joke, well, if he would have taken this class, he would have never made that error in this class. So, we're in a trade-off. This is a picture of the Earth from the moon. And it's a famous picture because when it was taken, it's just breathtaking to see the Earth. And by the way, all of our astronauts that have been up there, it's changed their lives. They became environmentalists when they came back. Viewing the Earth like that was profound. When you think about this, our Earth is a spaceship hurtling through the solar system, and we recycle our air, our water on the Earth. So what do we need to do to go to Mars? We have to duplicate the functions of the Earth. Everything we do here, we've got to do it on the way there and coming back. Here's the big challenge. We screw up a lot as humans, but we have oceans to put stuff in. We have air. We have soil to put our waste in. We have large masses to absorb all our waste. That's not going to happen in our system to go to Mars. So our challenge for Lance and I and our colleagues that have been working on this is to make a life support system that's very small and still stable. And you can imagine if it gets really small, it's efficient, but it might not be stable. If it's big, it's stable, but we can't afford to launch it. So this one slide outlines the challenges in a nutshell, trying to copy the Earth. And what we learn from doing this is going to help us a lot. It's already helped us give insights to what we could be doing on the Earth to live on this planet more efficiently.
All right, so let's do a little 101. This is basically how we function on Earth. And of course, all the energy that we use on Earth ultimately comes from the sun, right? The light energy. And of course, the way this works is photosynthesis, and many of you understand photosynthesis that occurs in plants and algae and bacteria. And of course, what they use is they use that light energy to take CO2 from the air. It's really low concentrations, but they can take that CO2, they need water, they need nitrogen, and out comes food and oxygen, the two things that we need. And so these are the systems that we're going to try to replicate on Mars. And just to take one step further, what do we use these things for? How do humans use these food and this oxygen and this water? Here's the oxygen, here's the water. And of course, we need three different kinds of food, classes of food. We need fats and proteins. We need carbohydrates. And what we use that food for is energy, right? So we can think and move. We also take those molecules apart, those proteins and those fats, into the elements so that we can reconstruct the things that make us human. So we can make our proteins, this is a protein, our DNA. And so we need that carbon and that nitrogen and the hydrogen and the oxygen to be able to build those molecules that define us as human beings. Bruce?
So what we're going to show you, we talk about this stuff all the time, back and forth, back and forth. What we're going to show you right here is the most important equation in the world. Now this has some inputs on the left-hand side and some outputs on the right-hand side. What do you think that is? E equals mc squared? This is a real simple equation, and you young scientists are going to learn it in a few years, and even in high school. This is in every single high school biology book. I bet you there's 20 classes on this campus that teach this equation. Now, we just saw CO2 and water. Wow, a low energy gas and water, and we magically turn that into CH2O is carbohydrate, food, a high energy solid and a high energy gas, oxygen. This is like magic, turning low energy gas and water. So for these young scientists, we got a name for this equation. Anybody know the name of this? Starts with a P. You nailed it. Photosynthesis. When this thing runs backwards, we also give it a name. That's respiration. So you're looking at the most important equation in the world. If we can run this equation on Mars, we're good to go. Here's the challenge. You have to follow what's called the first law of thermodynamics. You don't get to take low energy inputs, get high energy outputs. You have to push it. And we push it with light. And more specifically, we say photons of light pushes this equation across to these outputs. Now, can we do this on Mars? Well, do we have CO2 on Mars? You bet we do. That's 0.04% is the CO2 on Earth. On Mars, the atmosphere is almost pure CO2. 0.95% CO2 on Mars. There is plenty of CO2 on Mars. We can be growing 2x4s out of this equation. We just got to have plenty of light, and we now know there's frozen water on Mars. We can access the water, so we have CO2, water, and photons, and away we go with this equation. Now, when we were analyzing this, we think all these books don't have this just right because it doesn't convey how this one equation transforms really low energy things into high energy things. So we decided that we should write books with this same equation that looks like this. Boom, really tiny inputs and really big high energy outputs. And there's no free lunch, you don't get to go uphill for nothing. There's those 10 photons, push this thing uphill. But Mars has about half of the solar light that we have, so we have plenty of sunlight there. So we can grow food with this. We decided that we ought to call this equation the USU diagram and put it in all the books, make the university even more famous than we already are. So we often talk about, people say, what do you need to grow foods? Here's some plants from our lab right here with, this is a LED shining on these plants. What do you need to get this right? Of course, you need light. Here's the key parameters. And we often say there's 9 key parameters, and we tweak these to make this system really efficient. And it has to be super efficient and super reliable. On Earth, if we had some disease, we would run out of food. On Mars, if we had a plant disease, the first thing that happened is we would run out of oxygen. It happens fast. That's how we rely on this, not just for food, but the oxygen. The light's huge. We turn up the light, and the water goes through the plants faster. The whole system makes a jump to light speed and goes really fast. We would like to know how big the space farm has to be. Do we need 100 football fields, or can we do it the size of this auditorium? And it depends on how much light we have and how optimum we can get all the parameters in here. People say, well, we're this great, we'll build a greenhouse on Mars. Real simple, and you can see pictures by creative NASA artists like this all the time. Big greenhouse, the people are living in the back under the shelter. This looks beautiful. Who wouldn't want to go to Mars and work in the greenhouse? But look at right here. These are basketball-sized meteorites that come hurling in. There's not enough atmosphere to burn them up. Bam! They puncture the greenhouse. Remember all that cosmic radiation? We got to filter that. It's going to give everybody cancer. We can't have the cosmic radiation coming in. Our atmosphere on Earth has the same shielding protection as 10 feet of concrete. That's amazing. We don't have that on Mars, so we need to go underground with the light system. And here's another artist's conception with the people growing the food underground. Now I'm going to walk you through a little, this is the end of, close to the end of my part of this, a little experiment we did with colors of light. Everybody would, I bet you if I asked the question, some of you had high school science fair projects with colors of light on plants. Here's some lettuce in our chambers in the lab here. And you can see there's 2 colors of light. There's purple light and white light. Most people think the purple light is a special plant growth light. It's blue and red LEDs. This is white LEDs. And that this will make the plants grow faster. So we did this careful study, and the numbers up there are the intensity. 350 is a bigger number than 300, so we expect those plants to grow faster, and we expect maybe the purple light will make the plants grow faster. So we do the study, check the yield. Guess what? The 2 plants that had 350 were exactly the same. There's no advantage of those purple plant growth lights. You might as well use white light. It makes the plants look terrific. How about these other chambers? Well, surely they had less yield. There's less light. We all know if the light gets less, the plants grow more slowly. What happened? Wow. That chamber had 27% more yield with less light. Something's going on here that we don't yet understand. How about the other chamber with white? 135. So there's one little thing I didn't tell you. In these 2 chambers, we gave them 50 units of what we call far red photons. This is light that we can just barely see, and yet it has powerful effects on plant growth. To emphasize that, here's one of those bars of far red light. And it looks pretty bright, but you put it next to this. To our eyes, this doesn't look like much. We can trick the plants with this far red light into thinking they're in the shade. And they panic, and they spread their leaves out to get more light, and they weren't really in the shade. We just tricked them to think they were. That's why we got higher yield with less visible light in this experiment. Let me show you how powerful that is. There's white light with no far red photons, and the other one has 10% far red. It's a dramatic effect. That's something we've learned from our NASA research, and it has great implications for all of Earth agriculture. Soil. How are we going to grow these plants? What kind of soil? We have some Martian simulant here. There's a soil. Part of my department is soil science. It's a little vial. This is not really Martian soil. This is from a volcano. Looks like Martian soil. But we can grow stuff in the soil, but we need nutrients. We need fertilizers. These are the calculations on how many nutrients we need to bring for 10 people for 3 years. Look at the nitrogen. That's about half of the total is nitrogen. 200 kilograms. How many people is that in kilograms? How many people would it take to weigh 300, Rami? 3 people. And 3 people your size, 2 of ours maybe. That's a lot of weight of nitrogen. We going to bring all that with us, or can we get it there? Mars has nitrogen in the air, and NASA came to USU for help, turning that air into something useful. Ooh,
That's okay. Yeah,
we're missing a slide.
that's okay.
There.
Yeah. the
And Lance
question-
is going to
Tell us,
tell you that.
talk about nitrogen. So that's my expertise is nitrogen. And so my question is on Earth, let's come back to Earth for a second. Where is our biggest source of nitrogen? Say it again. Who said it?
Atmosphere.
Take a deep breath. You just took in a couple liters of nitrogen, right? So we don't have a problem with nitrogen, right? We have plenty of nitrogen. Our atmosphere, it turns out, is 78% nitrogen, right? So there's no problem with nitrogen. And that's shown here. This is showing you the percent. You already know this. Our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, a little bit of CO2 and other. So we have loads of nitrogen. Not a problem. Okay, so we try to grow some plants, and we can just bathe those plants in all this beautiful nitrogen, right? It's everywhere. We're growing them in air. And you see they struggle. They're really struggling. And so we can compare that. And this is an experiment that Paul Kazuma and Bruce's lab did. So there's plants where we actually are still bathing them in N2, but we added a little bit of ammonia to these. You see a difference? Yeah, so I'm bathing them in all the nitrogen they could ever want. They can't use it. Why? Anybody know why? The chemists can't answer this question. Why?
Because of the ammonia.
Well, the ammonia is fine. That's not a problem. But why can't they use the N2? They're being bathed in it. That's nitrogen, right? And this is a little experiment for general chemistry. Yeah.
Does it have to absorb it through its roots?
It does, but they still have lots of nitrogen. The problem is that nitrogen, N2, yeah, go ahead.
I think it's because the nitrogen's in the air instead of in the soil.
It's okay, it can be in the soil too. We can pump it into the soil. The problem is the form of nitrogen. Remember I told you the air you're breathing is N2. That's called dinitrogen. And it turns out dinitrogen has a triple bond between the 2 nitrogen elements, okay? And so it turns out, and maybe I'll pick on a young lady here, this young lady in the blue coat right here. Is it harder to break a single bond or a triple bond? She's Googling it. I'm asking this young lady who is our vice president for research and also a world-renowned inorganic chemist. She knows the answer. It turns out it's much harder to break a triple bond. And it's just like in the old days when you played, maybe some of you still do, with Tinker Toys. If you just have 1 stick between, that's pretty easy to undo that. But if I put 3 sticks between those 2 Tinker Toys, it becomes very difficult. And so what we know is that we have to break that N-N bond. It's a triple bond. I can break 1 with a little bit of energy. I can break 2 bonds with a little bit more energy. That's what Bruce was just talking about, taking CO2 and turning into carbohydrate. And now we're taking that up 1 more We have to break that in triple bond. That's going to take a lot of energy. And guess what? The plants and you and me, we don't know how to do that. So you can just bathe these plants in N2 all day long, and they cannot figure out how to get their hands on it because they don't know how to break that triple bond. They don't have the energy, they don't have the mechanism to do that. Okay, so how do we deal with this? Well, it turns out this was the challenge for food production in the world in the 1890s, in the late 1800s. It turns out we had plateaued in our food production at that time, and people were starving. There wasn't enough food to go around, and so there's widespread hunger in the world in the late 1800s because we had taken all the nitrogen that was already what we call fixed out of the soil. And it turns out there's a very famous German scientist by the name of Fritz Haber. Fritz Haber figured out how to break that triple bond in N2. And you might think he's a really good guy. He was trying to save the world from all the hunger. Turns out that isn't why he did it. He was a patriot of Germany. And you might remember in the early 1900s, what was happening in the world that Germany was involved in?
World War I.
World War I. And they were running out of fixed nitrogen to do what with? Make munitions. Remember, they were shipping it from Chile and Argentina as bat guano, right? And those lines were being cut off. And so he was not an altruist trying to help the world with hunger. He was a patriot trying to help the German military. And what he figured out how to do was how to industrially turn that nitrogen into ammonia. And this was, many people claim, was one of the most significant inventions of the last century because what it allowed us to do is to build plants like you see here. This is a fertilizer plant where you take N2 in and ammonia comes out, and this is what drove modern agriculture. And it's very well documented that when this reaction became widespread, that food production jumped up and the world population jumped up and followed that. And it turns out that the other key player in this was Carl Bosch. He also won the Nobel Prize, Fritz Haber in 1918, Carl Bosch in 1931. And he was an engineer, and he figured out how to take that simple reaction that Fritz Haber figured out how to do in the laboratory and convert it into this plant that you see here, how to turn that into a process. Now, the key thing about this reaction is, and I already told you the answer to this, it takes a lot of energy, right? It takes a lot of energy to break that in triple bond. And where does that energy come from? Well, the most readily available form of energy that we had at that time was fossil. So this is a fossil-driven process. It requires coal, and it requires fossil fuel in the form of oil. And this is a big demand. About 2% of the fossil fuel that we use on Earth today is used for this simple reaction. And that means that the CO2 footprint for this reaction is massive. About 2% of the world's CO2 output comes from this process. This was a game-changing reaction. It allowed humanity to start to grow again. People aren't starving. And most of the food that you get today is being driven by this really important reaction. Okay, so there's the answer.
Tell them about this.
Oh, and then there's many books that have been written on this. If you're interested in this topic and learning about Fritz Haber and this alchemy of air, how do you turn air that you're just breathing into something that you can actually use? So this is really quite simple, right? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take this Haber-Bosch, as it's called, fertilizer plant with us to Mars, right? So that's what we're going to do. And as Bruce already said, Mars has N2. It turns out it's a lower percentage, but we've done the calculation. There's more than enough nitrogen there to support 10 people for as long as you want to support them. Even a big population of people, 1 million people, would probably be pushing it a little bit, but we could support a lot of people on that nitrogen. So you can see that we have enough light, we have enough nitrogen. As Bruce already told you, it's mostly CO2. Okay, so there's no problem. We're just going to take that Haber-Bosch plant with us. Anybody see any problem with that? This came up with NASA scientists this week. We had a workshop here on campus, NASA scientists, and they said, nobody at NASA even talks about taking Haber-Bosch with us to Mars. And you can see why, because you'd have to take all this infrastructure, and as we heard when we first started, it's really expensive. I don't remember what the exact cost is per kilogram, $60,000 per kilogram or something like that.
Yep. Everything launched into space is worth its weight in gold. literally. So every ounce you can reduce the mass, you've saved that an ounce of the value of gold.
So, okay, so what are we going to do? I'm not going to take Haber Bosch with me. So what am I going to do? How am I going to solve my problem? Well, it turns out there is a natural process. And this natural process for converting into, taking it, we call it fixing it, reducing it into ammonia, occurs in bacteria. And these bacteria live in every environment. If you go outside right here tonight, you just dig up some soil, you will find bacteria that are doing this process. Turns out they figured out about 2.5 billion years ago how to do this. They figured out how to turn into ammonia. And there's multiple kinds of these bacteria. We'd have to see them under a microscope, of course, because they're smaller than we could see. But they can do this using carbon, food source. They can use it doing it with light. They can do all kinds of cool things. And they can do this. And that's how we support about half of all of the nitrogen that we need for food production, is through this natural process, these bacteria that can do this. They don't need any fossil fuel. And they don't need a big plant. Matter of fact, the plant that I'm proposing that we take with us to Mars is this. Does that look better than the Haber Bosch plant? This is the little vial that contains those bacteria that can do that reaction. And that's all I would need. I just need that and some sunlight and a little bit of water, and off they go. And they can make all the nitrogen we propose. They can make all the nitrogen that you would need to support life on Mars. Okay, so can we do it? Is it possible? And so this is an experiment that Maddie, who's a graduate student, is sitting in the audience. She and Paul Kazuma, I don't know if he came here tonight, but these are two graduate students, and they had this crazy idea that let's actually try it. And so it turns out that one of the crops that Bruce is pretty famous for is growing this wheat. It's actually called apogee wheat. He has this grown on the space station. And so we actually tried the experiment. So this is the experiment. This is apogee wheat with no added nitrogen, just N2 gas. You see it's sort of struggling here. Here we use the Haber Bosch big plant. We made some ammonia. We fed it to the plants. Those plants look better, don't they? Right? Here's what we did with this one. We just let the bacteria, no fossil fuel added, we let them fix the nitrogen, and then we added the bacteria to the plants. Which one of those plants looks better to you? The ones on the far right. This is a proof of concept. This shows that we can actually do this without fossil fuel. We can do it with that little vial as sufficient catalyst, as we call it, to convert that into a form that the plants can use. All right, so we're a little bit getting more sophisticated, so now we'll tell you about sort of the cutting edge stuff that we're trying to do. That was a simple experiment. Now what we're trying to do is we're trying to use solar cells as the source of the energy to drive those bacteria to do that N2 reduction. So let me sort of walk you through what we're doing here. We're using, this is sort of a fuel cell. We take water on the one side, and we can pull the electrons out of that and make oxygen. We need the oxygen, right, to support the astronauts. That's being driven by this solar cell. And then on this side, this is called the cathode, we can make hydrogen, and that hydrogen can be eaten by these bacteria as the source of energy to convert that into ammonia. And this is actually proof of concept. We actually did this. Maddie, who's in the audience here, actually just had a paper published in Frontiers in Microbiology demonstrating that we could actually do this process. And this is the cell that she used to actually demonstrate it. It's just exactly what you see here. We're taking this even one step further. So this is actually some work that's being done in Pei-Dong Yang's group at Berkeley. What he can do is he can take these bacteria. Here they are. You can see this is a microscope looking at these. These are the little bacteria. And you notice they're hanging on to these rods. Those rods are nano wires, and those rods can absorb light directly, so we don't even need the solar cell. They can absorb the light directly and give the electrons right to the bacteria directly. And we have some work that's going to be coming out in a paper soon that shows that we can do that. So we think that we can drive these reactions just using solar energy rather than fossil fuel. So maybe we're coming to the end here. Maybe Bruce will give us a little final thought.
This is a picture of the night sky. Could be anywhere outside this building, but it turns out this is a picture of the night sky from Mars. Now, do you see, remember how they go into Antarctica? If you look really close, there's a little tiny white speck. You know how you go outside and if it's a nice night, you can see Mars? Well, this is looking at that little tiny white speck from Mars. That's the Earth. We're all long ways from home. There's psychological effects we don't understand, all this cosmic radiation we don't understand. There is hundreds of scientists in NASA working on all the component parts of this right now. And we were very pleased to host them here this past week for a 2.5-day conference to discuss all these problems. It's a big challenge, but I think, and it's going to be an international effort to get there. I think we can rise to the challenge and do it. People say, how long is it going to take? Depends on the funding. It also turns out there's a launch window about every 6 years or so when the planets are perfectly aligned. But maybe not in our lifetimes, but in many of the young scientists' lifetimes in here, we'll be going to Mars. And all this stuff we're working on now, we'll put together to go. So I think we'll stop right there and leave you with this cosmic slide. And thank you. Thank you. That's the problem. Cost.
Go ahead.
So are you gonna send a human?
What do you,
Or are you gonna send a robot?
what would you propose?
A robot, so if something goes wrong, the human doesn't die?
I like it. I think that's what NASA's thinking too, is let's send robots first and have them do as much construction first before the humans go there.
In fact, we're going to probably send all our stuff first. All the supplies, we're going to make sure they're all there ready to go, and then we'll go and get them. So you can be sure there'd be robots before people, but the problem is if you only were there with the robot, were you really ever there? You really need a person there to say that you went to Mars. So eventually we'll send people.
So, 3 years into colonization, what did someone expect? What foods would you expect?
So let me tell you a story about a big NASA meeting. This is quite a while ago, 20 years ago. You can imagine NASA's a bunch of like rocket scientists and engineers, and how many species of plants we're going to need? And these engineers said, about 10 different species, that ought to do it. And a woman that was a nutritionist at NASA Johnson stood up and said, just a minute. She said, do you know that in an average week we eat the products of like 1,000 different kinds of plants? In a week, we need 1,000 different species to have a fully balanced diet for Mars. And it was this whole thing went silent, like, and the answer is somewhere between 10 and 1,000 for how many things we're going to grow. If we figure out how to grow 20, 30 things, it gets easier for the rest of them. And I think the longer they're there, the more diversity we're going to have. But it's a really interesting question. You know, how long can you go on vitamin pills and food out of a tube?
And lettuce. Can you eat lettuce
And
for how
lettuce.
long?
Early on, NASA was going to do algae. They're really efficient. But if you eat enough algae to get much nutrition, you get chlorophyll toxicity. You have too much chlorophyll. So even lettuce, you eat enough of this lettuce to get the calories, you'd have big problems with the massive amounts of lettuce.
Here's the hard questions now.
Several of the processes that you outlined require water,
Yes.
but you didn't say where you got the water from, I don't think.
Well, we now know that there is ice on the poles of Mars. And so one of the challenges we hear this, we're not part of this research, but we hear all the time is, where are we going to land? If you're going to land near the poles, you'd have your ice, and so you'd be able to melt it, but there's not much sunlight there, so then you really don't want to be there. So are you going to move the ice, or, you know, that's a challenge. But they do now know that there's ice there, so we have plenty of water.
That was a huge discovery.
Yeah.
It's evidence, pretty solid evidence that there's under the ground, there's frozen water.
There's frozen
And that makes it way easier to get
Right.
there.
I
I know that in the past, with things that have been sent to Mars and other places, they're really carefully like sterilized before they're sent. I assume once we're there growing food, that's no longer going to be a concern. Are we worried about like the impact on the planet as it is, or once we're colonizing it, we just try and make it as much like Earth as we can?
We're certainly worried about all the microbes. It will absolutely not be sterile. I mean, we couldn't do it. We're full of microbes, beneficial microbes in our bodies, so it won't be sterile. Some of our colleagues, it's a group at UC Berkeley, are studying the soil microbiome to beneficially inoculate with things, steadily inoculate the root zone. So we hope we're going to tip the balance to beneficial microbes. And they could escape, but boy, Mars is a pretty inhospitable place. Real low pressure, 1% of our pressure, cosmic radiation. Man, any microorganisms as we know them wouldn't last long if they escaped on the surface. If that was answering your question, what if they escape? But we hope to bring lots of beneficial microbes. Right behind you.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the question is, how are the bugs going to survive? Because there's no oxygen. And that's a good question. There is water, and we're going to turn that water into oxygen. And that's where the oxygen is going to come from to support the people. And what other organisms that we were talking about make oxygen? Do you remember? Plants. They can also turn water into oxygen, just like they do on Earth. The oxygen that you're breathing right now came from plants. Back to the back.
You talked about converting the nitrogen and instead of fossil fuels using the microbes.
Yes.
Is that cost effective to do that on Earth?
Yes, it is. And it works all the time on Earth. For example, if you go to the Midwest and you see all those fields of soybeans that are growing there, those are utilizing bacteria that are associated with the roots of the soybeans, and those bacteria are converting all the nitrogen that the plant needs as the source of nitrogen. So that's already used.
So is it lower cost than building a big plant like for Earth?
Yes, much lower cost, but it's low intensity, so that's why we can't do high intensity agriculture using just that. So that's why we need those Haber-Bosch plants to drive that.
To follow that up, that's a really good question. We grow a lot of alfalfa in this valley, and alfalfa is a legume. It fixes nitrogen, but we fertilize it. And we fertilize it with nitrogen made by Haber-Bosch, made by pumping fossil fuels out of the ground, because it is so cheap. And we fertilize our legumes because if they have to make the nitrogen themselves, it's a lot of work, the yield goes down. It's sort of sad that Haber-Bosch nitrogen is so cheap, and we're sort of polluting the whole planet with a lot of nitrogen by turning our fossil fuels into it. But they can do it, it's just a matter of cost.
Question over here.
How will Mars lower gravity affect the growth of plants and how do we deal with that?
Mars has about 1/3 of our gravity, so if you want to do a weight loss program, just go to Mars. You lose a lot of weight. And that is enough gravity so air and water separate, and that's a big deal because it's very hard to water plants without gravity. The water just sits there, waterlogs the plants. So there's some evidence that gravity is a stress on plants, and if we have less gravity, the plants could grow better. So we think 1/3 gravity is going to be fine. It's much harder with no gravity at all. And in fact, a colleague of mine in our department, Scott Jones, and I are just submitting a proposal to NASA for a new root zone module on the space station where there's no gravity. And we're going to meter the water in with syringes to get it just right. But there's no gravity at all, it is very difficult to water a plant. It doesn't drain out.
I want to tell you about, just quickly, one thing that we heard about some of our colleagues that are part of this project that we're involved in there at UC Davis, and this relates to the lettuce. They figured out how to genetically engineer lettuce so that it produces the pharmaceuticals that you would need to deal with all kinds of different conditions for astronauts at Mars. Because you think about it, someone calls up, say, I've got an infection. Okay, we're going to send you some antibiotic, and it'll be there in 2 years, right? You're dead by then. So we have to be able to have platforms to develop and produce the pharmaceuticals that you need in place. And what they've been able to figure out how to do is genetically engineer lettuce, this isn't the lettuce here, to produce Tylenol. And so they've already succeeded at this. And so if you have a headache, you just go eat your lettuce, right? Because it deals with that. They've also, the latest thing they're producing is a hormone, and this hormone prevents bone loss. And one of the things we know from people in the space station is that there's pretty rapid bone loss, bone density loss when they're in space because of the lack of gravity. And so there's a hormone that they can give the astronauts that maintains the bone density. They've been able to figure out at UC Davis how to produce that hormone in lettuce. And so it would be just part of the regular diet would be able to get the hormone. I think that's a pretty cool project.
It is. It is very cool. You wouldn't eat that lettuce all the time.
No,
only
you sure
when
wouldn't.
You needed it. But.
Right, right. Nick?
Yeah, so there's talk now of going to the moon and doing practice runs for Mars. How do you see that helping or hindering? What's the story?
How did you say?
Going
To the moon.
Is,
setting up a test
Yep, sure.
in order to prepare ourselves to go to Mars.
Yep, 2024, that's what they're being told, right? And NASA's holding to that. They're thinking they can make it to the moon in 2024 and put people there. And we heard this week from some NASA scientists, they view that as sort of a slingshot, right? So you sort of set up camp on the moon, and then from there you launch to get to Mars. That's how they're seeing it, yeah.
Jan Soika, the physicist, is here, but there's something like 20 times less rocket fuel to go to Mars from the moon than from the Earth, just because the gravity is so much less. So it's a great staging area. You don't have to have a giant rocket, just set it up and light the fuse on the moon. Yeah.
From this point in time, what do you estimate would be the closest pathway to get to Mars?
Humans on Mars.
How soon can we go?
Yeah.
It depends on funding. I mean, if there was some kind of imaginary emergency, national emergency, we could start building the rocket now and go. It would be risky because there's a lot of things we haven't studied very well, and it would be expensive because we'd bring more stuff than we really need. If you're going to a trip somewhere and you're not sure, you overpack. Well, that gets overpacking for a trip to Mars gets really expensive. So we're trying to calculate the minimum amount of stuff we need to bring and then make everything there. But it could be soon. And there's been many scenarios of when we think we might go. But it's such a huge project that we're still thinking about it. We don't have a specific date we're trying to achieve.
I'm really curious about the psychology of all of this and the impact on people. And just talking about bringing plants to Mars and having plants there that can do a lot of things that our planet already does. But have people talked about from insects all the way up to vertebrates, even the psyche of a human being. We're so passionate about even the aesthetic quality of the animals around us. And even if the plants could provide, it begs the question, why do we even care about the animals here if we can colonize just with plants, making everything we need on a different planet? And I was just wondering if that kind of thing comes up in discussion, how important are those aesthetic values and the love we share with our ecosystem as we know it now as human beings, as we've evolved with those animals, if we did try to colonize another planet?
We have NASA has some analog environments, we call them, and one of them's Antarctica. That's dark for 90 days, continuous darkness. And so there's about 70 scientists that live down there during that period. We have a greenhouse down there, run with electric lights and diesel generators, and they grow food in this bright greenhouse. And it's a little like this. You walk in there and it's bright lights and beautiful plants. So we do surveys. And how important was the greenhouse to you? And I am stunned by the results of those surveys. About half of the people say it was essential. I could never have stayed down there without, I went to the greenhouse every single day. I sat there and read a book. I went there all the time. There's another half that said, nah, I don't go there very much. And I'm going, whoa, I want to meet that other half. And no way do I want to go to Mars with that half of the group. I mean, it seems nuts to me to think that they don't need that. And I think it's just some hardened scientists that don't feel like they need plants. So I find that result really fascinating. It's pretty common to feel one with plants. And this Mars is going to be a straight vegan diet. We're not going to have animals. They're too expensive. It's all going to be not just vegetarian, but vegan. So how's that going to affect people? I didn't get all of that.
That's a great comment. We have some physicists in the audience, maybe Jan or somebody else want to comment on that, this idea of using a body basically as a way to slingshot. Jan, do you want to comment on that?
Well, our pioneer spacecraft, the Voyagers, they all were slingshot it out into space.
Yeah.
Their own kind of propulsion systems weren't strong enough, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
So they fired them towards Venus and the Sun.
Yep.
Different planets to align them, but also give them that extra boost to get away from our solar system. So yes, using the gravitational pull
Mm-hmm.
other planets, which is very well known.
Yeah, up here.
So back to that question about the psychology of it all. I'm just curious, are there people like lining up that are like, yes, I want to go to Mars? I mean, because I hear this and I'm like, I don't, no interest, you know? Blown away that there are volunteers.
Yes.
There are people that want to go.
Yes. I think they opened up a lottery, and how many people volunteered?
Yeah, oh man, many.
10,000, 30,000, something like that?
There's even people that say, just send me, I don't even need to come back.
Yeah,
I'll get a one-way ticket.
one-way ticket.
There's plenty of people that are anxious to go.
So how would you make it sustainable? Because you need seeds to grow the plants, unless you're going to just completely go clone.
We can use the plants, make the plants grow their own seeds. If we grew this lettuce long enough, a seed stalk would come up and make seeds, and then we'd harvest those seeds.
Pollinators for some of them.
We do,
unless you have
we
a
do.
lot of hand-pollinators.
Well, it depends on the plant, but yes, for the plants that are insect pollinated, and by the way, strawberries, insect pollinated, so we get electric toothbrush and we in a stick and we go in there and some of the people put a little tiny bee on the end of the bzz, bzz, but so you can simulate an insect. But yes, we got to grow our own seeds too.
One more question, please.
There's a series of books called Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars. And it is science fiction, but it's not magic. It's like they go there, and there seems to be in that book a race to use plants, lichen. They start out to grow an atmosphere, because as you said, plants put it out. So since you collaborate with NASA, do you have any sense about whether they're going to try to use the plant growing effort will be to feed people, or will the plant growing effort be like we're going to have the robots lay out a lot of stuff, but we're going to use plants to grow the atmosphere?
if you can remember that most important equation, when you run that back and forth, it turns out if you grow all of your food, you will get exactly the right amount of oxygen too. No more, no less. If you grow the food and then you eat it and that equation goes back and forth, you get enough oxygen, but no more. If you want more oxygen for the planet, you can't eat the food. So, and then you gradually would get more oxygen.